He placed the envelope on the table between us. A man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, a former deacon candidate who had left the formation process 6 years earlier. He did not sit down immediately. He stood at the edge of the chair and looked at the envelope as though he was uncertain whether he had the right to have brought it into a priest's office. I asked him what was inside. He said he did not know entirely. He said his sister-in-law, a woman who had spent years inside a community he described as spiritual, which I understood to mean syncretic, partly a cult, had mailed it to his home 3 weeks prior. Tucked inside the package, alongside a rosary she claimed had been blessed, was a folded paper he had not opened for 2 weeks. When he finally unfolded it, he found a prayer, not a Catholic prayer, names, instructions for a transfer. He had thrown it away. Then the dreams began. I have been doing this work for more than 20 years. The question I receive most often from the afflicted, from their spouses, from priests new to this ministry who are beginning to understand what they are seeing and have no framework for it yet, is some version of this. Can something that was sent to me actually arrive? Can a spiritual transfer be real? I want to answer that question carefully, and then I want to tell you what the church already has for it. My name is Father Chad Ripperger. I am a Thomistic philosopher and a trained exorcist. This is not a vocation I selected the way one might select a specialty in medicine. It came through obedience through superiors who saw cases mounting with no one properly formed to handle them. I have ministered across multiple countries, in parishes, in private homes, in facilities, across more than 2 decades. I tell you this not to establish a reputation, but to establish a context. What I am going to describe is not theory. It is repeated pattern observed across a very large number of cases, and the pattern in this particular matter is ancient. The man sat down. He described the 2 weeks since he had opened the letter in detail. He had run a fever for 4 days, no cause found by the physician he saw. His oldest son, 12 years old, an altar server, had stopped entering the small chapel attached to their home, not in the way you might imagine from film, no dramatic refusal, no performance of distress. He simply did not go in. When asked why, the boy said the room felt wrong. Children often perceive what adults have spent years learning to explain away. The man himself could not complete the rosary. He would pick it up, get 3 or 4 beads in, and his mind would go flat. Not distracted in the ordinary way a man's mind wanders at prayer. This is common. The doctors of the church speak to it extensively, but flat in a specific way, a sealed quality, as though the prayer were being absorbed before it could form. For 400 years, the church provided the laity with specific prayers to address situations in their homes that they could not explain. Most parishes stopped teaching them after 1965. Now, they have all been compiled into a concise, practical guide. Keep it near the door and read the first page tonight. You will find the link to get the book in the description and in the first pinned comment. He described it to me twice because he wanted to be precise. The words of the Hail Mary would not cohere. They would start and then stop, not forget stop. His wife had begun in those same 3 weeks to feel that something stood behind her in whatever room she entered alone. She saw nothing, she heard nothing. But the sensation was consistent, specific, and not neutral. She said the attention it carried was focused and hostile. I listened to all of this without writing it down. I have learned over the years that the act of note-taking during an account changes what people allow themselves to say. I watched his hands. I watched his eyes. His eyes were ordinary, worried, a little ashamed, a little relieved to be in a room where he was being believed. Whatever had entered that house had not reached him in the manner that possession presents. His cognition was intact. His religious instinct, the impulse to confess what had happened, to bring it into the light, was functioning. These are not the signs of the gravest presentations. This was something else. Aquinas, in the Summa Theologiae, Prima Pars, questions 50 through 64, gives us the most precise natural theological framework we possess for understanding fallen angels. They retain their created intellect fully, a preternatural intelligence that operates without the limitations of embodiment, without the interference of passion that distorts human reasoning. without the forgetting that comes with biological memory. They learn from observation. They accumulate data across centuries. A fallen angel that has been working against a given family line has access to information about that family, their wounds, their habitual sins, their specific vulnerabilities that would take any human investigator a lifetime to assemble. The devil, as St. Peter writes in his first letter, 5th chapter, 8th verse, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. The verb is seeking. It is not random. Aquinas is also clear on what they cannot do. They cannot create. They can work only through what exists. Fear that is already there, a wound that is already open, a door that the human person or someone in the household has already opened. The power they wield is real, but it is borrowed power, contingent power, power that has conditions. One of those conditions is legal ground. The Curé d'Ars, St. John Vianney, who died on the 4th of August, 1859, was physically attacked by what he called le grappin, the hook, for years. He made no public drama of it. He treated it as a condition of his priesthood, something that intensified when he was drawing souls out of darkness through the confessional. He prayed, he fasted, he went back to work. When asked about it, he said, "The noise was worse when good souls were coming." Padre Pio received the stigmata on the 20th of September, 1918, and reported ongoing physical combat with demonic forces throughout his ministry. The accounts are documented, examined by medical personnel and ecclesiastical investigators, and not seriously disputed by any historian working from primary sources. He spoke of the attacks matter-of-factly as an aspect of the spiritual life, and then returned his attention to the Mass and to the confessional, which he heard for up to 16 hours a day. I cite these men not for atmosphere but for pattern. The common thread is this: the demonic intensifies its pressure specifically where the sacramental life is functioning. This is not incidental. The enemy is not random. He applies force where force is most needed to stop what the church is doing in a given soul or a given household. Understand that, and you begin to understand what the man of St. Thomas Aquinas wrote more than a dozen questions on how fallen angels operate. Most Catholics have never read one line of it. This archive gathers that teaching, the 1,614 rite, and 4 centuries of documented cases into a single reference. Read it slowly, 1 chapter a night. You will find the link to get the book in the description and in the first posted comment in front of me was dealing with. The classification matters. Catholic demonology does not recognize an autonomous cosmos of marine deities, water spirits, ranked folk spirits wielding hereditary power over bloodlines in the manner taught by certain traditions. I want to be clear about this because the language of spiritual attack, return to sender, transfer of spirits, inherited assignments has entered Catholic circles from those traditions. And the framing, while sometimes gesturing toward real phenomena, is not the Church's framing. Aquinas gives us temptation, oppression, obsession, infestation, subjugation, and possession a continuum, not a separate cosmology. Named demons in Catholic exorcistic practice are named because the Church's prayer of exorcism addresses them directly, not because they constitute a bureaucratic hierarchy independent of God's sovereignty. In this case, the presentation was infestation at the household level, with oppressive symptoms extending to the man himself and to his wife. The door was identifiable. The paper had been prepared with intent and introduced into the home. That is an infestation entry point, the Roman ritual of 1,614 addresses directly. And the footholds, the lapsed confession, the unblessed home, the handled object were all things the sacraments and sacramentals were designed to close. Now, I want to tell you what the Church actually does about a transfer, if we are going to use that word, and I want to be exact about what I mean. The Church does not send anything back. The Catholic does not perform spiritual retaliation. I need to say this plainly because there are sincere people who have read about return to sender prayers, about binding spirits and redirecting them at their source, about cutting off the sender's power by reflecting the attack, and who believe this is consonant with Christian faith. It is not. Romans chapter 12 is clear. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. We do not weaponize the supernatural order against other human persons, however wicked their actions. What we do is different, and it is better. What we do is this: we remove the footholds. We bring the authority of Christ to bear on what entered. And then God, not us, God dismantles what was sent, because what was sent had no legitimate ground to stand on in a soul that has been absolved and is in a state of grace. Isaiah chapter 54, verse 17, no weapon forged against you will prevail. That is not the Catholic wielding a weapon back. That is God's justice operating on the conditions of the soul. The transfer backfires in the most literal sense. It returns to nothing because the ground it was aimed at no longer belongs to the enemy. That is the Catholic understanding of reversal. Confession is where this begins, tonight, not eventually, tonight, or first thing this week. The sacrament of penance is the mechanism through which Christ, through the authority he granted to the apostles in John chapter 20, verse 23, whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, whose sins you retain are retained, formally severs the legal hold that unconfessed grave sin gives the demonic. The man in front of me had been away from confession for 14 months. That is not a judgment. That is a fact, and facts have consequences. Every mortal sin that remains unconfessed remains an open door. The enemy has a claim on the ground of the unabsolved soul that he does not have on the soul that has been absolved. This is not rhetoric. This is Catholic sacramental theology as the Church has always understood it. You go. You confess specifically, not generally, not therapeutically, but the actual sins named in number where possible. You receive absolution. The hold breaks at its root. There is no other instrument available to a human being that does what absolution does in the spiritual order. It is not symbolic. It is forensic. The debt is canceled. The legal claim collapses. This is what backfire actually means in the Catholic understanding. Not a curse returned, but a foothold dissolved, so that what was sent finds no purchase. The Eucharist, received worthily after a good confession, is the real presence of God, body, blood, soul, and divinity. I have been in rooms where a person is being formally exorcised and the introduction of a consecrated host, consecrated, valid, the real thing produces a response from the afflicting entity that no other object produces. This is documented across the history of the Church's exorcistic praxis, from the accounts surrounding St. John Chrysostom through to contemporary case reports in the literature. The demonic cannot tolerate the real presence because Christ is not symbolically there, he is there. When a soul in a state of grace receives him worthily, it is the most comprehensive act of spiritual fortification available to a human being. Not one of the most comprehensive, the most. Go to Mass this week, prepare properly, receive him. The home blessing is not optional in this situation. What I mean is the Benedictio Domus from the Roman ritual, the formal blessing of the home by a priest using properly blessed water over which the full prayer of the Church has been said, with salt included as the Roman ritual prescribes, not water poured from a bottle someone labeled without the complete sacramental form. The prayer formally consecrates the space to the living God and calls for the expulsion of every malign presence that has entered. A blessed crucifix fixed to the wall, not set in a drawer. An image of Our Lady, enthroned in the household as queen of that home. These are not decorations. They are assertions of sovereignty. They are the Church's formal claim over the physical space, and they have consequences in the spiritual order. A home that has been formally blessed, that houses a family receiving the sacraments, that displays the sacred images of the tradition, that home looks different in a spiritual order than the home that has not been attended to. The presence of the Church's sacramentals is not superstition. It is the application of the Church's authority to a physical space. The demonic works through the physical. The Church responds in kind. He needed to remove from the home every remnant of the package, everything connected to it, every object from that relationship he had not personally examined, not in a state of fear. Fear is itself an opening, but in clarity. An object ritually prepared with intent to harm and introduced into a home retains its character as an entry point for as long as it remains. Out, gone. And he needed to pray to St. Michael I mean, the prayer Pope Leo XIII ordered, placed at the conclusion of every low Mass in 1886, after an experience he received that the historical record documents, though its details have been disputed. The prayer was suppressed in 1969. It is now in wide private use, and I encourage it. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. This was not written as sentiment. It was written because the Church recognizes that angelic protection is real, available, and operative in the spiritual combat of those who ask for it with faith. What I've just described to you, the footholds, the sacramental remedy, the angelic invocation, is precisely what happened in that man's case. He went to confession that week. He received the Eucharist on the following Sunday, his first worthy reception in more than a year. He had a priest come to bless the home. The boy walked back into the chapel 3 days after the blessing. Not dramatically. He simply walked in, knelt down, and prayed. The dreams the man had been having stopped the night after his confession. I am not telling you this to produce astonishment. I am telling you this because it is what happened, and because it happens consistently when the Church's means are used as the Church intends them. The pattern is not miraculous in the sense of being exceptional. It is the ordinary functioning of the sacramental order, which was built precisely for this. The collapse we are witnessing is not gradual anymore. After the Second Vatican Council, which closed in December 1965, the catechetical infrastructure of the Western Church was systematically dismantled, not by external enemies, but by those within who believed that the demonic was a category of metaphor, that exorcism was a relic of prescientific culture, that the new rite promulgated in 1999 requiring explicit diocesan permission before a single prayer of major exorcism may be prayed, a permission many dioceses do not grant and some actively withhold, was a pastoral improvement. The permission requirement was intended to prevent abuse. What it has done in practice is create a structure in which the Church's most direct tool against possession is bureaucratically inaccessible in many dioceses at the very moment when cases are rising. A 2019 Pew Research Center survey found that fewer than 1 in 3 self-identified American Catholics believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist as the Church defines it. Not 1 in 3 practicing Catholics, 1 in 3 of those who identify as Catholic at all. The sacrament that is the Church's most powerful single protection against the demonic has been catechized out of the belief system of the majority of those who should be receiving it weekly. The enemy did not accomplish this through possession. He accomplished it through bad theology, poorly taught for 50 years in schools and universities and parish programs that treated orthodoxy as embarrassing. The confession rate collapsed in the same period. No-fault divorce, which California enacted in 1969 and which spread to every state in the country within 15 years, did not simply affect marriage data. It restructured the moral imagination of the culture. If no marriage is a failure, no action is a sin. If no action is a sin, confession has no object. If confession has no object, the door is never closed. If the door is never closed, the foothold remains, generation after generation. I have seen this. It is not an argument. It is a pattern I walk into. I said earlier that I would give you only what is documented, what is composite, and what the Church actually teaches. I have done that, and I will close by saying it once more plainly. Everything I have described is anchored in the Church's own sacramental tradition, in Aquinas, in the Roman ritual, in the testimony of saints whose accounts have been formally examined. I have not invented a doctrine. I am not claiming private revelation. I am describing what the sacraments are, what they do, and what happens when they are used as the Church intends. Hold that carefully. Everything I have told you is verifiable in the Church's own documents and in the consistent testimony of those who have done this work. This is the action list, and I want you to take it as exactly that action, not aspiration. Confession this week, not at some point, this week. If you have been away 6 months, go. If you have been away 6 years, go. Find a priest who will hear you properly, who will treat the sacrament as what it is and not as a support session. Confess specifically. Receive absolution. This is the first move. This is where the legal hold breaks. Receive the Eucharist worthily. Go to Mass. Prepare with confession if you are conscious of grave sin. Then receive Him. The real presence is not sentiment. It is the most powerful protection you have access to, and it is available every single week, if not every day. Have your home formally blessed by a priest this week. Call your parish. Ask for the Benedictio Domus. Get properly blessed holy water from the sacristy. Sprinkle every room yourself. Put a blessed crucifix on the wall. Enthrone an image of Our Lady in your home. Remove any object you cannot account for. Anything received from someone involved in the occult. Anything you kept out of social obligation without examining it. Out of the house. Gone. Consecrate your family to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The act of consecration is a formal placement of the family under Christ's sovereignty and Our Lady's intercession. It changes the spiritual, legal situation of the household. Pray the Rosary every day, not as devotional color. As the weapon, it is used the way the saints used it, at minimum 5 decades. 15, if the day permits, find a sound priest for spiritual direction. One who will hold you to the truth, who knows the tradition, who does not reduce the spiritual life to psychological categories. Build community with other families of genuine faith. The isolated Catholic family is the most exposed target. Embed in a real parish community, one that gathers for more than the minimum, one where people know each other and hold each other accountable to the faith they profess. Form your children in the full content of the faith, the actual catechesis, what the sacraments are, why confession is not optional, what the Eucharist is, what the Blessed Virgin is, and why she matters. If you do not teach them, the culture will, and the culture is not catechizing toward God. The Church has been here before. The Arian crisis of the 4th century denied the divinity of Christ and infected most of the episcopate. Athanasius stood essentially alone, Athanasius contra mundum, as the historians recorded it, and the Church outlasted the heresy. The French Revolution attempted to destroy the Church in France through systematic violence, priests martyred, religious killed, churches stripped, and reconsecrated to reason. The Church survived. The communist regimes of the 20th century imprisoned bishops, infiltrated seminaries, and subjected the faithful to decades of state-sanctioned persecution. The Church survived. Not through optimism. Optimism is a temperamental quality that closes its eyes to evidence. Through hope, which is a theological virtue that rests on what God has actually promised and on what history has actually demonstrated. That the remnant which holds the sacraments outlasts every assault that has ever come against it. God is with us. He has always been with us. The question is whether we will be with Him. The next matter I want to address, and it is something I have been encountering with increasing frequency in the last several years of this ministry, is the question of generational debt. What happens when the door was opened, not by the person in front of me, but by a grandparent, a great-grandparent, someone who made a vow in darkness that was never formally renounced, and whose descendants are now living with the consequences? That is where we will go next.